The Council of Jerusalem is one of the most important events in early Christianity. It was held in 50 AD to answer the question, do Gentiles need to keep the law? The next council in church history will be held 300 years later, in 325 AD, at the Council of Nicaea, in which the question was, is Jesus God? These councils are both pivotal moments in the development of Christianity, and in this video we're going to be analyzing the significance of the first council in Jerusalem. The council was led by none other than Jesus' own brother James, and he decides that Gentiles do not need to keep the Jewish law. James will quote from Amos 9 verses 11 to 12 to justify his decision, and then concludes by saying the following, quote, "Therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God," end quote. Now, the controversy surrounds James's quotation of Amos. Many will claim that James misquotes Amos here. He changed the words of the text, ignored the context, and thus inappropriately used Amos. Is there any truth to these claims? Well, I'm very excited to explore these with you today. And before we begin, if you enjoy these types of videos in which we explore the minutiae of Christianity, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help with the channel. And consider becoming a patron to support my work. Okay, let's delve into this topic now. Does James mistranslate Amos? Well, James quotes from a Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint, and the Septuagint was translated from the original Hebrew text. And this translation was done well before Christianity ever existed. Now, most scholars will say the mistranslation didn't occur with James, but rather the Septuagint mistranslated the Hebrew, and then James simply quotes this mistranslation. As one author notes about this situation, quote, "It's clear that Acts chapter 15 verses 16 to 18 presupposes a Greek version of the Amos text. In verse 17, this is obviously the Septuagint, which deliberately or not has mistranslated its Hebrew text," end quote. Now, to determine whether this is true or not, what we need to do is compare the Hebrew to the Greek text. So let's begin by analyzing the Hebrew text and the original context of Amos. So, in Amos chapter 9, Amos is looking forward to the future king who will restore Israel to his past greatness under the reign of King David. In verse 11, we read the following, quote, "On that day I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen, and repair its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old," end quote. So Amos here is looking back to the golden age under David in which we had a united monarchy. As we continue to read, we read the following in verse 12, quote, "In order that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all nations who are called by my name," end quote. So here we are again reminded that under David's reign, Israel had control of Edom, a neighboring country, and all of the other surrounding countries to Israel as well. In 2 Samuel 8, we're told that David conquered all of these surrounding nations. We read in 2 Samuel 8 the following, quote, "From Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and from the spoil of the king of Zobah, Hadassah, son of Rehob," end quote. Now, in the very next verse in 2 Samuel 8, we're told that David achieved his ultimate fame by specifically conquering the Edomites. We read the following, quote, "David won a name for himself when he returned. He killed 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all of Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went," end quote. I want you to appreciate the emphasis that is placed here on David conquering Edom. We then finally read in 2 Samuel 8, "So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people." Commenting on the relationship between 2 Samuel 8 and Amos 9, Friedman writes the following in his commentary, quote, "We are told in 2 Samuel 8:15 that David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. This statement reflects the ideal set forth by the prophet Amos repeatedly in his book. And the subjugation of Edom was the last of David's campaigns, leading to the full establishment of justice and equity for all his people in all of Israel. So here the same pattern is envisaged with a brief reference to the last campaign," end quote. So Amos believes that when the future Messiah appears, he, like David, will also conquer Edom too. Amos may also be inspired by the prophecy of Balaam here as well, which also makes mention of Edom. So in Numbers 24, Balaam makes a prophecy about the future Davidic Messiah, saying the following, "A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and it shall crush the foreheads of Moab, and the heads of all the Sethites. Edom will become a possession, one out of Jacob shall rule, and destroy the survivors of End quote. Okay, so now we have a full understanding of Amos 9:11 to 12 from the Hebrew text. Let's now compare it to its Greek translation, from which James will quote from. So let's bring the Greek translation up to the right here. So the Greek translation says the following, quote, "So that the remnant of mankind and all nations upon whom my name was invoked upon them will search for me," end quote. Okay, hopefully you notice two big differences here. The first is that in the Hebrew, it uses the word possess, not search, and the word Edom, not mankind. Okay, so let's explore this a little further here. The word possession in the original Hebrew has the connotations of military conquest, while in the Septuagint, this word is translated as search, thus portraying the nations freely pursuing the God of Israel themselves. Next, the word Edom in the Hebrew makes the text specific to the Levant, areas surrounding Israel, while the Septuagint translates Edom as mankind, making it no longer specific but universal. And you're probably wondering to yourself, how on earth did Edom become mankind? Well, in the Hebrew, these words are almost identical. So this mistranslation is understandable and perhaps even intentional. Commenting on the differences between the Greek and the Hebrew, one author makes the following comment, quote, "In the Septuagint, Amos 9:12 differs from the Masoretic, yet the difference seems to take place on the Hebrew level. They will possess is read as they will seek. Likewise, Edom is read as humankind." Now, let's just for a moment focus on the Greek translation, which, unlike the Hebrew, refers to so much more than simply Israel's neighbors. The Greek text has the whole world in view. Thus, when James reads that one day all of mankind will search after the Davidic Messiah, he sees this as relating to the Christian message. Thus, James decides not to burden these Gentiles who are freely seeking the Lord with having to keep the Jewish law. Thus, at the end of the council, he will say, "Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God." Okay, so let's now return to our comparison of the Greek to the Hebrew for a moment. And it does appear that James is making a theological point based on a mistranslation of the text. Or to say it another way, Michael Bird, an Australian academic, frames it like so, quote, "Thus, Luke roots his Theology of Gentile Inclusion in a Septuagintal gloss of the Hebrew text that offers a vision for Gentile inclusion not on the basis of military subjugation, but on the basis of Gentiles searching for God." And that brings us to the end of this video. Please make sure you hit that like button, leave me a comment, and subscribe. And for my patrons, you'll get a bonus part of this video in which we're going to go through some Dead Sea Scrolls and also talk about how the prophet Obadiah relates to Amos 9. Some fascinating stuff there for my patrons. If you want to get access to this bonus material and support my work so I can continue making videos like this, please consider becoming a patron today. Patrons keep the lights on and allow me to continue making these videos. Thank you for watching until the end. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Okay, my patrons, thanks for the support. Let's now get stuck into this fascinating patron exclusive content. First, let's look at this Dead Sea Scroll 4Q Floor, which comes from Qumran, and it quotes Amos 9 verses 11 to 12. And the context of this quotation is the expectation of the coming Messiah, just like the early Christians. It is remarkable that we have writings of two groups that exist at the same time and place, both quoting from the same Old Testament passages about their expectation of the Messiah. That's what makes this Dead Sea Scroll so fascinating. All right, the Qumran community existed near the Dead Sea. Let's bring up the map and put them on it. Just for some context, here is where Jerusalem and Bethlehem are. And this group that lived at Qumran were known as the Essenes. So the Essenes were one of the groups that lived at the time of Jesus. And they were there 150 years before Jesus and finished up during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. They wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a specific Dead Sea Scroll is this one right here, 4Q Floor. Here is a part of it. And on this Dead Sea Scroll is writings about the hope of the coming Messiah, and it will quote Amos 9, verse 11. Okay, so let's give it a read. It says, "He is the branch of David, who will arise with the interpreter of the law, who in Zion in the last days, according as it is written, I will raise up the tent of David that has fallen, who will arise to save Israel," end quote. So it's not a huge quotation here, but nevertheless, it is proof that both the Essenes and the Christians at this time viewed Amos 9 as messianic. As one author writes, quote, "The text of Amos 9:11 is appropriated by both Luke and 4Q Floor. Both of our interlocutors read this text with a specific appeal to its eschatological and messianic meaning potential." Okay, let's now talk about another really interesting part of Amos 9. This is something I'm really excited about, and it's this idea that Amos 9 is a later addition to the text. At first, I was pretty skeptical, and I'm probably still a little skeptical, but it is pretty convincing, and you'll probably walk away at least understanding where people are coming from, if not totally convinced yourself. I'm probably still on the fence. So let's talk about this for a moment. We're going to begin by looking at the breakdown of Amos. And in our last video, we said how Amos was broken up into these three parts, and Amos is almost exclusively about judgment, except for the last chapter. In chapter 9, we have some hope. And this hope seems a little bit out of place. But that's not the only reason why people say that it was a later addition. When we read Amos 9, verses 11 to 12, there's something odd about it. So let's give it a read. It says, "On that day, I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen." Now, the reason why that's odd is because at the time of Amos, the booth of David hadn't fallen. At the time of Amos, King Uzziah was the king of Judah. He was the Davidic king at the time. So why is Amos talking as if there is no Davidic king at the time? And thus, people will say that Amos 9, 11 to 15 is a later addition to the text. It was written after Judah's exile in 587 BC. Okay, a quick review for a moment so we can understand what's happening. There are two important dates you need to know. The first date is 722 BC. This is when Israel is exiled. So the Assyrians come in 722 and they invade Israel, and Israel will never again go back to the land. The next important date we must remember is 587 BC, and this is Judah's exile. So now the Babylonians are on the scene, and Nebuchadnezzar II will come down and exile Judah. This is when the Davidic line ceases to exist. So when we read Amos 9, 11, 12, it makes a bit more sense in this context. "On that day, I will raise up the booth of David that has fallen and repair its breaches and raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old." Amos is talking as if there is no Davidic king at the time, which means this must be dated post 587 BC. As one author notes, quote, "According to the plain reading of the text, the booth of David has fallen down and is still not raised up. Thus Amos 9, 11 to 12 should be dated after the end of the Judahite kingdom, 587 BC. According to this text, the Davidic dynasty will again come to power, and Jerusalem and Judea, destroyed by the Babylonians, will be rebuilt. Then the Judeans will subdue the surrounding lands and the nations, including the tribes of Edom." This now brings us to the next point, and that is the mention of Edom. So in verse 12, we're told that in order they may possess the remnant of Edom. How does Edom fit into this if we're talking about a post-587 BC date? Well, we know that when the Babylonians attacked Judah in 587, the Edomites actually joined in and attacked Judah as well. This is what the book of Obadiah is all about. The book of Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament, and it is a condemnation of Edom for attacking Judah during the Babylonian siege. I very much recommend you give it a read. Let's read some key passages. It says, "Edom, because of the violence you did to your close relatives in Israel, you will be filled with shame and destroyed forever. When they were invaded, you stood aloof, refusing to help them. Foreign invaders carried off their wealth and cast lots to divide up Jerusalem, but you acted like one of Israel's enemies. You should not have gloated when they exiled your relatives to distant lands. You should not have rejoiced when the people of Judah suffered such misfortune. You should not have spoken arrogantly in that terrible time of trouble. Finally, you should not have plundered the land of Israel when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have gloated over their destruction when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have seized their wealth when they were suffering such calamity." So what it seems to have happened, and what Obadiah is criticizing, is Edom actually attacking Judah when the Babylonians were also attacking them. So thus, when we return to Amos 9, 11 to 12, it makes sense that Amos would point the finger at the remnant of Edom because he still has this hostility to them. So the remnant of Edom also makes sense in a post-587 date. One author writing on this says the following: "The reference to the fallen booth of David has seemed to many scholars to be a reference to Jerusalem after 587, 586. And the singling out of Edom among the nations seems to reflect the particular hostility towards Edom as the country that took advantage of Judah's fall." We continue. "For these reasons, this section has frequently been seen as a post-exilic addition." End quote. And that's where we're going to end this patron-only section. We discussed the Dead Sea Scroll and Obadiah. Thank you so much for being a patron. You really do mean the world by supporting the channel. Just as I've got you here, and I imagine many of you have clicked off, but if you're still here, you can listen to me talk because you deserve it. You've made it this far. I wish I could give my patrons more, but I think at the very beginning of this channel, I made a huge mistake of cutting off videos halfway through and say, only patrons can get them. That's a great way of isolating your audience, a great way of making them hostile to you. And I think those people just never return. I think that's why this channel has really, hasn't grown the way I would have hoped. But I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to make these patron-only sections at the end be separate and not that you feel like you've been robbed because the video stopped halfway. But then it means I can't provide my patrons as much as I wanted. I want to provide my patrons a lot. So I apologize, I can't give you more, but I'll still continue to give you really good quality patron exclusive stuff like this. Let me know what you want. Let me know in the patron chat. Type in, I want more of this, and I will definitely sort that out for you. Thank you again for being patrons. You mean the world, and I'll see you all soon. Thanks again. Bye-bye.